Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Amanda Zelahusky. We're going to discuss pandemic parenting, which we will explain in just a second. Dr. Zelahusky is a professor of psychology here at Purdue Northwest and the director of the clinical training. She's a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist and attorney who specializes in childhood trauma. Dr. Zelahusky works clinically with adults, children, and families and provides training and consultation to numerous mental health, legal, educational, and child welfare agencies. She's also the mother of three, who today will share her learned experience and passion for child development. She was recently featured on an ABC News report to discuss her podcast, Pandemic Parenting, a podcast whose mission is to share science-based knowledge, experience, and resources with parents and caregivers navigating the COVID-19 pandemic in ways that are immediately accessible and useful. The podcast was created by Dr. Zelahusky and Dr. Lindsay Malloy. They're both psychologists, scholars, and moms. I think the best thing to do is to start with what's the context of COVID that puts pressure on parenting and child development?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. I think a lot of it has to do with the uncertainty. So we as a human species are not wired to kind of live in this ongoing uncertainty. Clinically, we would sort of describe it often as like hypervigilance. You're worried about your safety. We didn't have from the beginning clear guidance on, what this means, what we should do, how dangerous it is, for whom is it more dangerous. And so then making decisions for our own health and safety and our families became very complicated, and the weight of these decisions was quite heavy because it had to do with our safety and well-being. So this long period of uncertainty and very weighty decision making, I think, is a big contributor to why this has been so difficult for us, especially for parents and kids.
It's been like 2 years.
We're nearing 2 years, that's right.
We're just kind of coming out of it, maybe.
Here's
now.
hoping, right.
And you're right, there seemed to be disparate, even contradictory information, even coming from the CDC from week to week and from the White House. So what does that do to a parent that's trying, I'm worried about Johnny, I want to make sure that he's okay, but what do I do?
Right, and where do I find credible information, and how do I know what information to trust, and why is the information changing constantly? And I think some of that has to do with often, just in our sort of day-to-day lives, the notion of science literacy and understanding the process of science and how science is constantly changing and why that's the case. And even when it's constantly changing, why does it take so long to get information, to get answers, how long research takes to sort of be started and then completed and then disseminated. So the answers were changing a lot, so especially for parents we had to make decisions. We had to decide, after the initial sort of few months of the pandemic, when it was clear that we were going to have, round 2 potentially in the fall of 20, do we send our kids back? Can they go back? Should I send them back if that's an option? I mean, these were very complicated decisions after 5 to 6 months at that point of seeing mental health decline in our kids, seeing increases in anxiety, isolation, social deprivation, and being worried about a lot of those things. Academic regression was a big concern. So we had to make decisions, and we didn't have a lot of the guidance, you're sort of referencing, and even the places that did feel trustworthy, like the CDC, for example, American Academy of Pediatrics, it was changing because the goalposts kept moving, and that's how this pandemic worked.
The science kept moving, and then the findings kept moving, and then the suggestions. But that would tend to create anxiety even for people that are looking at the information.
Yeah.
Because they said one thing today, they said another thing tomorrow. How can I make a decision?
How do I trust that if it keeps changing? We're not used to that happening with some of this decision making.
Well, maybe we'll talk a little bit about the vaccines, but I know that's true, because once it said people that were getting vaccines were getting infected, it's almost a knee-jerk response to say, well, see, I didn't think vaccines were working anyway because it's anecdotal, and we don't have science to tell us how many or why people are getting infected.
And imagine trying to explain that to young kids, where it was, okay, until there's a vaccine, we can't do A, B, C, and D. Okay, now there's a vaccine and you can get it, and now you're safe. This is what we've been
But you
waiting
still
for.
have to wear a mask.
Oh, wait, right. Now we can't do these things. Or yes, you do have friends or family members getting sick even though they got the vaccine. And so that's really confusing for us as adults. And then trying to explain that to kids that, well, wait a minute, you said we could finally go to this or that place or event now that these things have happened and you're changing that.
One of the things that I noticed is often the conversations on NPR, ABC, or in the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune were among people that were almost able to rise above the pandemic. I mean, here at P&W we had online classes for a semester, so I could teach from home. So if I worried about my kids, I'm at home with the kids. But people that were, sometimes they call them frontline people, but people that had to do deliveries, truck drivers, nurses. I mean, they didn't have that option. No. So it created bigger problems even in terms of childcare. So
and further exacerbated the disparities and inequities we already knew were there related to things like childcare, access to technology. All of those disparities were there. And the pandemic has just driven a further wedge in that. So what a difference, right? For me, for example, I could work from home. My job was flexible in the ways that you described. We could switch things to online. I have a spouse who also had a flexible job. And so
you could even do consulting with
that's
your clients, right?
We could do everything really from home. I mean, it was pivots, right? For everybody in these industries, that definitely disrupted and changed the mental health service delivery format in lots of ways too. But so we had all the resources we needed. Arguably, we had flexibility. It was still pretty stressful for us to constantly do this matrix of, okay, you're watching the kids for these 2 hours while I'm going to jump into this class or this meeting, and then we'll switch. And so it was this constant negotiation of who's...
And the kids can't come and interrupt you, right?
Whose
Usually
work's
they
more
can
important.
ask.
Exactly. And so knowing we had what we needed, we were safe, we had some flexibility, we weren't at risk of losing our jobs necessarily in those contexts. Now think about this for so many hundreds of thousands of families who did not have those layers, who were a single parent, working several jobs, frontline did not have childcare, and yet kids were having to be in remote learning situations. I mean, it was brutal for a lot of families, and I think that's the difference sometimes, is recognizing that disparity.
I heard the pandemic parenting, your first episode, and you said you and Dr. Malloy said that you had come to the conclusion that you were going to embrace good enough parenting.
Yes.
Which immediately raised in my mind, well, what's good parenting, what's bad parenting, and what's good enough parenting. So maybe you could share with us what you mean by good enough.
Yes. So the notion or the concept of good enough parenting has, long-standing roots. It's been written about in developmental psychology and other areas of psychology for a number of years. And it's basically this idea that there's a certain threshold of things all children need, that it's important to be warm and nurturing and be consistent and provide structure. There are these certain elements that are critical to a child's ability to thrive and develop in the ways that they need to, that we want to see them thrive and develop. And then there are things over and above that, which are great. So if you think in the extreme, Dr. Malloy and I will often talk about sort of the research and conversations around like super parenting, right? When you have your kids scheduled every single minute of the day and all these activities, and we're enriching their lives, and that sort of other extreme. But what the research tends to indicate is that there isn't much difference above that good enough parenting, like what kids need as their foundation, and that super parenting as far as kids' long-term success in different areas and domains. So what that tells us is, at the end of the day, kids need certain things, right? They need to have consistent, nurturing love. They need to feel safe. They need to have structure and predictability in their lives. And so when those things are there, that's what's important. It isn't necessarily all of this over and above.
It doesn't matter what the structure is?
That is a great point. I'm glad you said that. No, not necessarily. So whether your family constellation looks different than what somebody else might consider the traditional structure of a family, no. If that's a single parent, if that's two parents, if that's same-sex parents, if that's extended family in the home, it's what that caregiving network looks like and what the relational interactions look like that are more important necessarily than who is providing that care or what that structure is. So when we talk about good enough parenting in the pandemic, that was a really important piece of many of the conversations we had and resources we were putting out, because for most of us it became like, what is the bare minimum I can do right now? I can't do so many of the things I used to be able to do. There just isn't bandwidth. This is sort of relentless in trying to parent 24 hours a day and do my job and just do everything that's being asked of me under all of this stress. So I think it was pretty important for parents to sort of feel seen and validated that, like, it is okay to not be your best right now, to not be mom of the year.
Well, is it okay if you have your 6-year-old cooking dinner for the family? I mean, that could be a structure.
Well, I think there's a lot of follow-up questions, right? Like,
Yes.
well, what are the safety mechanisms we're putting into play? I don't want my 6-year-old touching the stove.
And when you say loving and caring, I mean, I've read those things about the monkeys that were separated from their parents, and they didn't ever get touched except with
It's about that
fake,
nurturing.
right? So there has to be
That's
hugs,
right.
and there has to be some connection. It can't simply be, well, here's your dinner, sit down, eat, go to
Exactly.
bed, I'll see you tomorrow.
Exactly. Fundamental to that nurturing isn't just their basic needs like food, clothing, and shelter. It is the warmth, the nurturing, the structure, the consistency, and even in things like discipline, being sure that your sort of consistent kids know what's expected of them. So when you have the chaos and disorganization, that's where things start to get a little bit tricky, emotionally. Is love being given and then withheld and sort of things like that. So
You didn't do the dishes, so I'm not going to give you a hug tonight.
right, exactly. Using kind of some of those emotional threats can be really damaging.
Yep.
And so
And I would think under the conditions of the pandemic that, because everybody's under stress, everybody's anxious, and it would seem like that would, not intentionally, but often could come out.
Which is also okay. I think that was the fear is, my kids certainly saw us under way more stress than usual and, hit our breaking points at various stages. And I think that's also important for parents to remember that it's okay for your kids to see that, because actually what's happening is you're modeling aspects of resilience for them. They are watching you work through stress and conflict and seeing how you go about that. Maybe if you and your partner have arguments, how you resolve that. So it's not that we don't ever want our kids to be exposed to stress or conflict. It's how they see us sort of work through that.
How do you handle it?
I think kids really learned a lot about how strong their parents are, how resilient they are, and how when you're faced with stress and uncertainty like this, you're navigating it, because it's teaching them how to do that too.
I still think, the back of my mind, I'm still thinking that parenting classes would be a good thing for all of parents.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not suggesting you're not saying that, but it's there's certain things of how to express care and love, how to organize a structure. What are the needs? What are the needs? I remember being at a playground when my kids were little, and a little boy was playing with his truck and his sand, and his mother said, "Come on, it's time to go." And he said, "No, I want to do this." And she said, "That's not important." But for the 3-year-old, that was his whole world. And to not recognize that, I don't hold her responsible, because how would you know that if it's not brought to your attention? But
no, I think that's a really vivid example. And it goes to, even if it's not parenting classes specifically, just understanding the basics of what child development, like what do we expect at each stage? What's reasonable to expect from your child? And if you've never had exposure before you become a parent to what's reasonable to expect from a 3-year-old versus a 13-year-old, then it's going to impact how you're interacting with that child and how you're maybe setting them up for success versus failure, right? If I expect things of you that are just not reasonable to expect of a 5-year-old, I'm setting you up to fail, to get in trouble. Now we're in this power struggle that maybe didn't even need to happen if I had better understanding of, oh, well, this is why you're impulsive, because you're 5, not because you're trying to be willful and disobedient.
You're not ADHD, you're 5.
Right.
Well,
and so what is normal?
What you're bumping up against is something else that came up in one of your podcast episodes. Was about trauma, because obviously there's trauma with the pandemic, which in one level it's probably a minimal level for parents, but it could be much greater. So the question I had after I listened to that was, what's the difference between living in trauma and being informed about trauma? Because you talk about trauma-informed parents.
Sure.
So could you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, happy to. So part of it is recognizing the difference between stress and trauma, right? Trauma has become this sort of colloquial word. You'll hear people saying things like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so traumatized by whatever, fill in the blank."
And they mean they're stressed.
Right, exactly. And most of the time they mean they're stressed or something upset them, which is to be expected in that situation. But the actual term trauma often has to do with, your life safety felt jeopardized in some way, felt threatened. There was a really intense experience that pushed your ability to cope with that beyond what we would reasonably be expected to be able to cope. So there's lots of examples of things that are considered traumatic, but it can also have to do more with how you're impacted by something. That if you and I were in the same experience, car accident, let's say, you might have not really suffered any emotional effects of that or been okay in the long term after being a little shaken up, whereas I might have had, flashbacks and lots of anxiety around being in a car again. Like we might have had very different experiences of that after the fact. So that also has a lot to do with whether something is considered quote unquote traumatic, right, is what your effects are. So that's a part of this conversation, is the difference between what is stressful and what is traumatic. And so as a parent, trying to be a trauma-informed parent, you need to figure out, okay, is the reaction myself or my child is having to whatever this situation is typical given the circumstances? I would expect that somebody would struggle in this way for a period of time afterward. Or is it lingering? Is it starting to cause sort of dysfunction or impairment in other parts of their lives? Are they?
So parents should be monitoring or noticing this
Yes,
if their children
yes.
are like not wanting to finish dinner or not wanting
Well,
to do things
it's
that they.
more around like things that they enjoyed that they're not interested in
Yeah.
doing anymore, or these were friends I liked to be with that I've kind of withdrawn from, or I really loved family game night or being involved in these things, and now I'm just really kind of isolating. Nightmares, sleep. So regression is a big piece of that. If your child had met certain milestones like being potty trained or staying dry through the night, or they're starting to have more separation anxiety, like have they regressed in some things that they had previously
That's an indication that the
accomplished?
stress has gone over into
Right.
something more
That
serious.
there's a lot more we need to pay attention to than just, okay, this was a tough experience, they're upset, but they'll get over it. That's partly, trying to disentangle, is this just stress? So I need to give them maybe a little bit more love, care, attention, or do we maybe need to get a mental health professional involved because they're having what seems to be like a post-traumatic reaction?
How should a parent go about talking about that? How
Yeah.
should they address this? I mean, I don't think you certainly just phone
No.
a psychologist and say,
Right.
I got to bring Johnny over. But
Right.
so what kind of techniques or behaviors, or even how would you communicate? I'm sure it has to do with their age, but
Yeah.
what
does that look
how
like?
should
Yeah.
parents approach this?
Yeah, I think the first step is exactly what you said, is talking to them, having communication. So yes, you want to be mindful of what's sort of developmentally appropriate based on their age to talk to them, but no matter what age they are, there are ways to specifically talk to kids. So we actually did a whole podcast
Although it's harder to
episode.
talk to teenagers.
Yes, it can be. It can be. There are other times where teenagers actually will let you know exactly what they're
Yeah,
thinking, whether
okay.
you want to know or not. So I think pros and cons there.
Sorry
but-
to interrupt.
yeah, no problem. So we had a podcast episode and webinar specifically on this that's packed with great strategies, question prompts for kids at different ages. So I definitely encourage folks to check that out. But some of the main takeaways I would say are create time and space to have conversations. And those aren't necessarily going to be when it's convenient for you. So the classic example would be, right around the time when we're putting kids to bed, it's quiet, they're sort of processing their day. Nighttime can be a pretty vulnerable time for kids. That's a common time that if you are an exhausted parent like me, a lot of nights you're like, thank God we read the story, kiss, kiss, good night, I'm out of here, right? It's my time to sort of decompress. But those are the moments that the kids will say, can I tell you something that happened at school today? Or I'm kind of scared of fill in the blank. That's a big deal. So to listen to that, and sometimes we miss those cues because I know, come on, it's time for bed, we'll talk about it tomorrow. And that's what I think is pretty amazing about being a parent, is that you get a lot of do-overs. So if you realize later, you know what, I think that she was trying to tell me something in that moment and I missed it. Come back to it. Come back to it the next day and say, you were mentioning something and I'm sorry that I didn't catch that seemed important to you. Can we try again? Can we talk about it now? So create opportunities, time and space. You mentioned teenagers. one of the best times I think to talk to adolescents is when you're driving, right? When it isn't this face-to-face where
They
we're sort
can't
of
jump out
staring at
either.
each other, right? Eye contact, that intensity
Yeah,
can be hard.
yeah.
So sometimes when you're just sort of driving and you're quiet, they'll bring things up, or that's a time you can ask about things. Or I like lots of other indirect strategies like, hey, what's your favorite song right now? Do you mind sharing it with me? Tell me why this one is kind of connecting with you. They'll tell you a lot when they can sort of displace it. So create time and opportunities to talk with them. And part of it is managing your own emotion regulation. When traumatic things happen to our kids, that's about the worst nightmare most parents can imagine, right? We want to protect our kids from things that are difficult for them. So when we suspect something has happened or when they're telling us about something that has happened, watching your own reactivity, because they are watching you like a hawk. For any little cue of whether you believe them, you're mad at them, this is making you sad. And so a colleague,
And a lot of that's unintentional.
unintentional, you're
Yep.
upset, of course you're upset
Yep.
and you're reacting. And so a colleague recently said to me, which has just stayed with me, children only tell us what they think we can handle. And I think that's really key, that if you are in an emotionally regulated space that can hear it, your child will tell you what's going on.
Well, as we look back, this raises one of the other things that you addressed in the pandemic
Yeah.
parenting, but it seemed to be parenting in general, because you talk about how do we talk about things in the past, whether they're positive
Yeah.
things or negative things. It may be birthday party or it may be grandpa's death. I mean, how do we talk about these things with children, and why is it important to talk with kids about the past?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I immediately thought of things like critical race theory and some of the things
Mm-hmm.
that some legislatures would like to take out of the classroom, which
Yeah.
doesn't apply to parenting, obviously, but it's the same kind of approach, that we don't like what happened, so we don't want to talk about what
Right.
happened. Is that that's certainly not mindful, but is it an effective strategy? If something happened in the past that we don't should we just not
right.
discuss it?
No, because it's there, right? And let me tell you, the kids have questions. Whether you are wanting to answer those questions or talk about these things or not, creating opportunities to bring up things that happened is actually a really important part of all of our healing. So avoidance is not usually ever a good strategy, particularly around things that have caused anxiety or have caused distress in the past. It's important. Now, if a child is doing okay with something that has happened and you've checked in about that and how are you feeling about that, fine. It doesn't mean you need to belabor it and interrogate them every 2 days about how they're doing. But if they're bringing things up or you haven't created any opportunities to even just check in about it, I do think there are things that can be festering that we might not even know are on our kids' hearts and minds. So it is important to say, well, let's reflect, like, wow, the last 2 years, anniversaries are a great time to do that, birthdays, just milestone dates. We're coming up on 2 years of this pandemic. Like, let's talk about what do you remember about the beginning of that or parts of that? What was hard for you? Because for a lot of kids, there are also parts of it that were positive, that there were benefits. They got to spend more time with their family. I think parents would be surprised at how some of aspects of this their kids are recollecting versus what we assume, right?
Yeah.
We go to the worst place of, man, this was so hard. I probably screwed up these things. And I think you'd actually be surprised at how your kids remember some parts of this and the ways you tried to create warmth and joyful memories, even amidst your own stress. So yeah, create opportunities to reflect, check in with them. Don't assume you know how they remember things or how they're doing.
How do you balance that, and what should we be expecting children to learn from that experience, including the academics that they're trying to learn?
One of the positives I see coming out of that is in conversations with lots of families over the last couple of years is how much kids learned about their own learning and their own sort of social preferences. So for some kids, let's say, who maybe were more introverted, there was relief in some of those periods of time where they were on Zoom. They didn't have to navigate complicated cafeteria dynamics, who will I sit with, bullying situations, those kinds of things. There were other kids who learned, wow, I do really well in person, and that is my preference, and I didn't like being on Zoom for any number of reasons. And for us in our roles with college students, for kids to already be learning these things about their own learning styles, social interaction styles and preferences at such young ages, by the time they get to us in college, to have a good sense of those things is huge. I mean, think about how many students we have who really aren't sure what their preference is. They've maybe never taken an online class, and so the first time they try to, they tank because they're struggling without having some of that scaffolding that comes with being in person. So I think for a lot of kids, when it came to learning, they had these metacognitive processes that they wouldn't have otherwise. They learned about their learning. And along that journey, so did we as parents. I learned about my kids' learning styles, what sort of subjects and strategies they struggled with more than I ever would have just in the classroom, because they come home, their worksheet has whatever sticker on it. And so that was really illuminating for me as a parent to kind of have glimpses into some parts of those journeys. So yes, are parents worried about academic regression, ways kids might be behind? Of course we are. But the other piece of this, again, I come back to the fundamental needs for kids, which is that sort of safety, consistency, warmth, nurturing, and predictability in their lives. The more we can restore that, the better able they are going to be to learn. Because if they are still feeling threatened, under distress, in different ways, unsafe, then none of us can learn in an environment where we don't feel we're safe.
I'm sorry, we could talk for much longer. Thank you, Dr. Amanda Zella-Husky, for being with us. It's all the time we have on the program. Thank you for joining me. I'm Lee Artz for the Roundtable Perspective. See you next time.